Thank you so much, Petra. This was great. Okay, so welcome to this session on meeting nutrient needs in a changing environment. Let me deconstruct the theme for you a little bit, following up on our keynote speaker. How do we meet nutrient needs? So it's obvious to everybody by now that we don't eat nutrients, we eat foods. And those foods have to be tasty, safe, affordable, nutrient-rich, and with low impact on the environment. In fact, the 4 pillars of sustainability are health, economics, society, and the environment. Very often we go from nutrition to the environment. That is incorrect. There are 4 pillars: health, economics, society, and the environment. In fact, you know it already, the major drivers of food choice are taste, cost, convenience, health, and variety, the themes that were so ably touched on during our keynote presentation. So this is about meeting nutrient needs, not just nutrients, but also foods, but also meals, but also meal patterns. We'll be making the connection between nutrients and foods going all the way to dietary patterns and the total diets and health. Now let me talk a little bit, 2 minutes I promise, about the changing environment. What is changing? Who or what is driving the change, and what are the possible consequences for the population and also for the food industry? Let's not forget the food industry. So here we have a number of components. The way I think about things is that we have 3 components of changing environment. First of all, economic. Second, social. And third, driven by climate change. And we'll be hearing about those 3 concepts in this session later on in a few minutes. Now, the economic environment, to my mind, is extremely important, if not the most important, because as nations get richer, they want more animal protein, especially meat. And when you look at the data from the FAO and the World Bank, you can look at how the progression of animal protein increases as incomes get higher. My point is there is absolutely nothing that can be done about that. These are forces beyond anyone's control. Some rich nations have now reached what's called peak meat consumption, and they're kind of nibbling at the idea of plant proteins. Are we going to go to plant proteins? Are we not going to go to plant proteins? But the rest of the world is going towards more animal protein and more meat, and this is consistent with Bennett's law, formulated in 1941, and my position is, we can discuss this, this cannot be stopped, which means that when you read that we have a diet of 63% animal protein or 68% animal protein in France, and we need to go back to 2040 or 60-40 or whatever it is, mark my words, it's not going to happen, period. This, of course, is a controversial point. We can discuss this. So the second issue is social, and again, the issue of acceptability of plant proteins versus animal proteins. That's something needs to be debated. And then, of course, then we come to the issue of ultra-processed foods, or foods falling into the ultra-processed category. I will not talk about that because we had a session on that. Let me just make one basic point, again, controversial one, to be discussed. My position is that if you want to achieve affordable nutrient density, and everybody does, this cannot be done without fortified processed foods, period, end of story, the end. That's it. So that is my position, and everything's open to debate. This is where we're all here to discuss things in a friendly environment. Don't be afraid to ask questions. The speakers will have some of the answers, not all the answers. We'll do the best that we can. So let me stop here. I've said enough, and I want to introduce Professor Alexandra Johnstone, who is research-based academic based at the Rowett Institute, University of Aberdeen, which is the lead for nutrition and obesity. I fondly remember Phil James, but it was before your time, Alexandra. I think that was way before. So welcome, worthy succession here. Thank you for coming, and we're looking forward to your presentation on protein needs and mechanism of protein intake regulation, exactly the topic of plant proteins versus animal proteins and other concepts as well. Thank you.
So first of all, thank you to Petra and her colleagues for inviting me to my first time at Nestlé. So I'm delighted to be here with such distinguished speakers. And thank you, Adam, for your kind words. And I do remember Phil James. And yes, the Rowett has changed a lot over the years. So what am I going to be speaking about today? So my brief is to look at protein needs and mechanisms of protein intake regulation. So I've split it into 4 sections. Hopefully I can kind of stick on time. So let's just kick off by looking at protein in particular, protein amount. So I'm based in the UK, so I have got a bias towards the recommendations. So I'm showing you the Eat Well guide. So Eileen eloquently introduced how we can consider food, nutrients, but in the UK we have even more complex public health dietary advice as the Eat Well guide, which I find quite confusing because we don't eat food groups, as Adam said, we eat meals and snacks. With reference to protein, we have clear dietary advice as reference nutrient intakes expressed per kilogram of body weight, which does not align well with the higher needs that are international recommendations. And as Adam said, we see global patterns of meat consumption with an increased trend towards increased consumption, and that's particularly of red and processed meat. And of course, the World Cancer Research Fund and the World Health Organization recommend consume no more than 500 grams of red meat a week, with an emphasis on less processed meat. And that's because of the increased risk of colorectal cancer. I think it's interesting that Norway just launched their dietary guidelines last month, and they have put a cap at 350 grams. So that's interesting in terms of how that's going to be perceived from a public health perspective. So yes, we don't eat protein as a nutrient, we eat it as snacks and meals and beverages. So our basic kind of proviso here in terms of protein for health is that we should be eating about 25 to 30 grams of protein to support our health outcomes, but with emphasis on plant whole foods, and we'll come back to that. Now, I'm often told, oh, well, Alex, you know, why are you studying protein? You know, most people consume enough protein. And I would challenge that, and I'll show you the data that I have. And in a particular group of people, and that's those that are aging. We have an aging population, particularly in the UK. We have more people aged over 60 than under 18.5. And we need protein as a particularly relevant nutrient to prevent sarcopenia, or the loss of muscle mass that is associated with aging. So this is some data that I presented a number of years ago, but we can see here that we've set the limits at 0.75 grams per kilogram of body weight, and this is for adults using the NDNS data set in green, so 74% of adults consume enough protein. But if we apply the international recommendations, which is 1.2 grams per kilogram body weight, only 13% of the aging population meet protein needs. And because this is a few years ago, I've got a great team working with me just now. It's really nice to have young people who are so inspiring and you know, enthusiastic. So David has redone analysis on the most recent Scottish Health Survey data, and if I draw your attention to, I don't seem to have a, oh, is this pointer working, I wonder? No, okay, let's put it on. Yeah, there we go. So protein is this panel here, so we can see the percentage at risk of inadequacy, so we can see about 40%, and that's for both males and females. So because we're in Nestlé, then I put in a couple of slides on some of the work that I've done, particularly thinking about plant proteins, but this is really thinking about more broadly about how we can support protein-based products for different microenvironments, different sectors. And I don't have a huge amount of time to go through these, but I've kind of highlighted in blue some of the main features. Cost is a limiting factor, a reliable supply chain. We need to consider industry perceptions of quality versus quantity in protein. We need to think about consumer awareness, labelling requirements, but all in all, we want to think about two factors that are also important, which is the consumer acceptance of these different types of protein foods. But industry is very well equipped and is proactive at raising their game towards these different challenges. And this is just the last sort of industry perspective slide, just to flag up that we did some work already looking at all of these topics in terms of different plant proteins, whether we're using concentrates, isolates, or other types of formulation solutions. And for example, we set up a macro to look at amino acid composition and how we can blend different proteins to get an optimal protein mix within a meal structure. So Eileen presented some data on protein intake in Ireland, and I guess the UK National Diet Nutrition Survey data is no different. So we have a huge reliance on poultry and beef as a source of protein, followed by eggs, and then right at the bottom we've got our deep fried fish and chip supper that's very popular, and the number 3 I've highlighted because it is the only plant-based protein that meets the top 10, and that's baked beans, and can't seem to get beyond baked beans as our only sort of plant protein source, and there are so many other types of beans. So this shows we're heavily reliant on animal sources of protein, and really we should be swapping in plant proteins for that meat protein. So what are there? Just a quick reminder, we've got a huge source of legumes, nuts and seeds, grains, and then of course milk is produced from cows, so we need to think about alternative sources there. So we've got a wide range of plant-based milks and different supplements. I'm sure we're going to hear more about the definitions of sustainable diets, but I just put this up to share my ethos, which is a whole systems approach in terms of that it should be nutritionally adequate, but should be cost effective and culturally acceptable, and that's often forgotten about from the consumer perspective. So still sticking with protein, and this is protein timing. And I've got the NINS data here because it clearly shows protein intake per meal, so breakfast, lunch, dinner, snacks. And these 2 bars here is the area that indicates the amount of protein required per meal, and that would be to maximally stimulate muscle protein synthesis. And we can see we often fall short at breakfast and snacking episodes, but only need to reach those recommendations for lunch and dinner. So I don't know what you all had for breakfast. Did you go for a high protein breakfast? Andy was sitting with me, we've seen a small dollop of scrambled eggs. That still wouldn't have been enough, but you know, we need to think about eating episodes and how we can achieve maximal protein intake across the day to achieve our health outcomes. And I've done a lot of work recently on chrononutrition. It's kind of a new field. We know a lot about circadian rhythm, but less about how food for shift workers, for example, could be incredibly important for their health outcomes. So my brief is to look at mechanisms. So I've put in a short section here on some of the mechanisms that I'm particularly interested in as a nutritionist. And the first point here is that I'm interested in protein-induced satiety, and the short answer here is we do not understand how protein-induced satiety works, and particularly during negative energy balance, during weight loss, protein is highly satiating, and this is not understood. I can try and simplify it to say that we've got cues in our environment, like we've got all the nice snacks in front of us that we might be nibbling around, but we've also got our internal cues in terms of our physiology. And that's why I run these highly complex human volunteer studies where I completely control the food. I like Daniel Tom's work. He has emphasis on the brain as a central appetite control system, and that is incredibly complex. I don't work on rodent models, but I do have colleagues that do. So we know that protein probably has a signalling system to the brain via the vagus nerve or the bloodstream, or both probably. We know that the role of increased satiety in protein ingestion decreases motivation to eat and impacts on our reward system. We don't really understand the role of decision making, and then I've put in the question mark the role of timing of eating. Does protein have a different impact on satiety and appetite control at different times of the day? I think that will be an area of interest in the future. So I've tried to pull together in text so that colleagues can watch this again. So apologies, it's a bit more wordy, but we know that physical structure of protein has an impact on our physical sense of fullness. PYY, of course, and all the other gut hormones and GLP-1 is incredibly important in terms of the biomarkers of appetite control, and we can use different feeding routes to help elucidate the feedback from the stomach and the brain. We know that liver is really important because of the amino acid physiology, and we can manipulate our amino acid profile. The direction of amino acids in the brain entering, of course, via the blood-brain barrier is something that's a little bit more tricky to measure in humans. But for example, we have done PET scan studies and MRI studies, which I don't have time to show you today, but it's an area of interest. It's just costly, and I would say the shift is away from mechanistic studies in terms of funding in the UK and more towards sort of public health nutrition. So I've adapted John Bundell's classical satiety cascade. I've popped in my area of interest, which is the circadian rhythms. I've just hopefully, if he was here, he might agree that that has a role to play in terms of meal timing, because we can think about eating in terms of meal quality, meal quantity. We get feedback to the brain via nutrient status, and of course this changes whether you're in a positive or negative energy balance. So this just is a different way of thinking about the complexity of the system. And then I think this is my last sort of mechanistic slide, to embrace that we learn about eating. So conditioned association means that we experience novel foods and we understand the physiological consequences, which can then feed back reinforcement. So if you get a positive physiological response, so eating chocolate gives you energy, increases blood glucose, improves concentration, gives you a sort of energy boost, relieves hunger, then that will be a positive reinforcement. If you eat something just now and then you go away and be sick, then that's a negative reinforcement. So of course we can learn new behaviours, and that's particularly important if we're thinking about substituting in plant proteins. I don't do a lot of work on hedonic control. I would direct you to Graham Finlayson's work on this in terms of the balance of eating for energy or eating for reward. So let's touch on now public health policy. I'm coming back to the Eat Well Guide because the Carbon Trust shows that if we did follow the Eat Well Guide, then it would be much lower environmental impact. And this, I like using this slide because when I first looked at it, it's showing us this panel here, the number of Eat Well recommendations as percentage of population. I kept reading, thinking, well, kind of where is it? But it's so tiny. Panel A shows that less than 0.1% of the UK population do follow the Eat Well guidance. And I'm like, so we can then pull out specific food groups, as it are, again. So particularly for dietary fibre, oily fish, we eat too much sugar, etc., etc. So, why do we not follow that guidance? That's a big question. Why do consumers not follow guidance? Because when they go into the shopping environment, this is, the importance of asking consumers. So only 50% of consumers going into a retail environment will be looking for a healthy option. Less than then 1 in 5 will be looking for plant-based or eco-friendly or sustainable. So you've lost half your consumers before you even market your products. Now, we do have lots of dietary advice to transform our food systems to more plant-based. I think I agree with Adam. I think this is not feasible on the global scale. Flexitarian approach might be more feasible. So to put that in context, only 5% of the UK population would identify as being vegetarian. And then just wanted to highlight, because I'm talking about protein, when we talk about sustainability, there is an estimated demand for animal protein is projected to increase by 80% up to the year 2050. And that's going to be a real challenge to produce that amount of animal proteins. So there has been a review of the Eat Lancet Commission, and I've pulled out a couple of comments there that report has definitely increased public awareness, but it has been criticised because it's insufficient attention to other parameters other than just greenhouse gas emissions. So we should be thinking about more a food systems approach, the whole food chain, and not just greenhouse gas emissions, but also the impact on land use, biodiversity, water use and deforestation. And as I said, my ethos here is sustainable, low cost, healthy and culturally acceptable diets for all, not just those that can afford it. Okay, so my last section here is to pull on really, well, what can we do if we're transitioning more towards a plant-based diet? So I've got a couple of students who've been doing some work on vertical farming and really thinking about, does vertical farming have this potential to address some of the challenges and goals for the food system transformation with emphasis on high protein foods? So David produced this really nice diagram to sort of introduce the complexity of this, and that we know that what we eat impacts on our health, but also impacts on planetary health. And this controlled environment agriculture, which is the sort of fancy term for vertical farming, or vertical farming is a feature of that, of course, impacts on climate change. Now, a vertical farm introduces a controlled environment, but does actually still involve taking energy because it's plugged into electrical supply. So thinking about this whole systems approach, it's quite novel in the UK to be using this technique. So in a big vertical farm tower, we collaborate with IGS. They're based in Dundee. I've got a mini vertical farm in the Rowett, which I love for bringing kids in to see plants growing and then get them to make smoothies. And I think that's great fun to show people, you know, where does food come from and how can we change the plants that we grow. So by changing the light, the nutrition, the temperature, gas composition and the different plant material, we can get different plant-based products that have intense taste profiles. So for example, I work with a company that want mint for their mint sauce, and they want an enhanced taste profile, and that vertical farm produces plants that are able to consistently produce that all year round, for example. But of course I'm interested in nutrition, and I can't show you the data on protein, so if you just sort of bear with me, and when I speak through about zinc and iron, you have to take my word for it that soon we'll be able to release the data on growing plants that are higher in protein. But as a concept, I'm showing you growing kale, baby leaf microgreens and pea microgreens under different conditions where we had standard and then used the water solution to embrace zinc dosing and iron dosing. And what happened to the plants. So we could see that for the zinc dose crops, a portion could increase up to 40% of reference nutrient intake for zinc, and one portion of iron dose crops could cover 28% of reference nutrient intake, which would be highly significant for example, the ageing population that are low in these micronutrients. But what about consumer acceptance? So we did some consumer survey work, and 79% said that they would purchase a VF product if it was labelled higher in vitamin and mineral content. And we also showed that there's no difference in willingness to pay between grown in our vertical farm or commercially grown, so consumers weren't able to tease those two different growing structures out. So we really need to think about the cost structure of vertically farmed food and not make it so costly that it means that the general population can't access the biofortification, which is what we're trying to achieve. So just to pull together some thoughts, some food for thought for you, what we eat and how often and how much we eat can not only impact our own lives, but can influence the health of the planet. Now, we are all experts in food, because we all do it nearly every day, and so we should consider every eating episode as a chance for nutrition to positively benefit our health. And pull together some future research perspectives. We do need more mechanistic studies to understand the role of protein and, of course, amino acids for protein-induced satiety. We eat foods, not nutrients, so consumer awareness and evidence around sufficient protein intake, particularly to support healthy ageing, and attitudes towards healthy plant-based foods is very important to reach that culturally acceptable component. We need to think about age, BMI and sex-related differences. I'll be doing some new work next year on looking at gender, which is really exciting, and pre-menopausal and post-menopausal women in particular. And then if we are going to be producing new foods, or at least reformulating, not only do the foods have to be sustainable, but they should be healthy. So one should not be a challenge to others, so they should be healthy and environmentally sustainable. So just to say thank you for your attention, and just to obviously say that I get to stand and speak to you today, but I do have an amazing team back at the Rowett, and thank you to them and my volunteers. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. That was wonderful. Thank you again. Please hold the questions until the end. We will have a moderated discussion with plenty of time for everyone's questions, including some of my own. We'll come back to the issue of how come no one's following dietary guidelines? 0.1% is a wild overestimate, in my opinion. And yet they live. What's going on here? We'll talk more about that. So our next speaker is Professor Andrew Prentice, who's Professor of International Nutrition at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. He lives and works in the Gambia, West Africa, and he's particularly interested in micronutrients and maternal and child health, and I particularly want to hear more about micronutrient deficiencies in the context of Africa, with a focus on priority micronutrients: calcium, iron, zinc, folate, vitamin B12, vitamin A, and it's actually not escaped anyone's attention that those missing micronutrients very often come from animal foods. Go figure. So, Andrew, you next. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. I hope I'm not going to disappoint you by talking about some other things. But obviously those we'll get to mention. Thank you, Petra. Thank you to the team. It's wonderful to be back at one of these amazing meetings, and it's really a pleasure to be here at the Nestlé Research Centre. So as Adam has introduced, I'm perhaps one of the few in the audience who sort of bridges the two worlds. I live and I work on populations who really struggle to make ends meet in terms of their finances and hence their dietary choices. But of course, I, my family, my friends, we eat diets that are of the type that we've been mostly discussing so far. This is my title that I've been given. I'm going to spend the time giving you a few examples. Time is short, so I'm really going to have to apologize for being very superficial in some of these instances, and I'll end on a slightly more detailed vignette, which I hope will show you the power of micronutrients in one particular circumstance of great interest to me, but should be of great interest to all of us here. I love to work with Nestlé and with the Nestlé Nutrition Institute in particular, and it's important to me to make those disclosures whenever I speak. So let's start with Nutrition 101. What are micronutrients? Adam just listed very comprehensively and competently. I didn't catch whether you said riboflavin, Adam, but riboflavin is one that is often not mentioned, but is incredibly important. So what do we have here in front of us? We quote, in terms of nutrient requirements, 13 essential vitamins divided into fat-soluble, water-soluble, essential minerals. Look at those, that they have specific positions in the periodic table, and they're chosen by biology because of these very complex electron structures, which give them some very important characteristics in terms of redox actions. We have 9 essential amino acids, some conditionally essential amino acids. We have 2 series of essential fatty acids. We have only 1 essential sugar, but it's useful to be consuming a lot of these structural sugars in order to save the biological work of having to make them all out of glucose and other compounds. So really this is very simple. And if you look at all those, they're relatively simple chemical structures. Mike Golden classified these into 2 different types, and I think this is also useful. He broke them into type 1 nutrients. Type 1 tend to be associated with specific enzymes and processes. We have body stores of those. If we don't eat enough, we continue to grow as children because there are sufficient stores to allow that. And because we continue to grow, when we then become short of those micronutrients, then we develop specific clinical symptoms, and you'll be familiar with many of those. Let's take iron at the top there. Of course, if you're short of iron, you continue to grow. It doesn't affect growth whatsoever as far as we can tell, but it does cause, ultimately, anemia. The type 2 micronutrients have a more general effect on metabolism. There are really no significant body stores. When we don't have those, growth slows and stops. And as a consequence of stopping, then we don't have clinical symptoms. So that's your quick 101 on micronutrients. Complex, of course, but actually, if you take an overview like this, very, very simple. So you might forgive some people from assuming that we could just throw these in to a packet and have a completely artificial construct of food. These, of course, are the Silicon Valley whiz kids who think they can do everything better than the rest of us. Amusingly called Soylent, those of you who remember the movie from over 50 years ago now of Soylent Green, where it turned out at the end of the story that the compound, the food that the starved world was eating, was actually made of recycled humans. Now, I would make the case that that is not an intelligent way to go, and some of you have made similar points already this morning. If we look, and I just sort of delved into the literature, this is not an area of my expertise, but if you look into the chemical multiverse of food chemicals, then there's this enormous diversity, perhaps over 72,000 different components of food. The big diagram shows all of those put together, many of which we don't even have a label for. We just know that they have a mass spec signal. And on the top right-hand side of that, that sort of orange-brown, are the FDA acknowledged food substances. Now, amongst all these additional compounds that wouldn't be in Soylent, of course, we all know that some of these are generally beneficial: non-starch polysaccharides, fiber, monounsaturated fatty acids, phenolics, antioxidants, probiotics and symbiotics. Of course, these would be generally useful. We know that amongst those, there are also those that are harmful in excess. The saturated fatty acids, perhaps cholesterol, although, of course, views have changed on that a great deal. Tannins, phytates, which block the absorption, for instance, of iron, and nitrates in excess and other pro-oxidants. We also have in foods many additions, colorings, flavorings, etc., etc. I'm not going to dwell on those, both because they're not an area of expertise, but because Julie's going to talk about those later in this meeting. Just finish this point that food is how we should be taking our micronutrients with the following examples. If you look into this FoodDB database, You could just look at Swiss cheese, Swiss chard. I should have put Swiss chocolate there. But you can see that these have a multitude of compounds, which I'm sure have both good and bad, but certainly probably very important components that we should not be missing out on. And hence this speaks to the whole remit of this conference, from nutrients to meals to balanced diets. And this now then becomes a challenge for me, because in many of the population that I work with, we do have to go back to individual micronutrients as supplements because they cannot achieve those from their diet. So let's start talking about some of the critical windows for micronutrient interventions. Preconception is really important. We've got this phrase of the first 1,000 days. I push back on that. I mean, that's been incredible for advocacy, but I would push back on it because it omits the period before a conception. First 1,000 days goes from conception to 2 years of life. The period before conception is incredibly important, as I shall show you in a vignette at the end of my talk. Pregnancy, of course. Some of you will know that the human fetus undergoes what is reckoned to be 45 of the 47 differentiating cell cycles that make a human. 45 of those occur while still a fetus and before birth. So clearly this is a very, very important period for us to get the balance of nutrients and micronutrients right as we construct a new person. We've got some enormous historical success stories, and thankfully it would be very difficult to take pictures on the left-hand side, and Eileen saved me time by showing a graph of the immense work that's been done by the IDD in terms of global iodine fortification of salt and other compounds that has really made these clinical features of iodine deficiency a thing of the past. We all know the folic acid story. And that has been one of the most important, one of the most powerfully evidence-based discoveries in human nutrition, and has had a huge effect on reducing the incidence of neural tube defects in those countries where it is mandated. In the UK, Eileen, forgive me, but we still haven't mandated it for very perplexing reasons, but let's not go there. And I don't know what the situation is in terms of Switzerland. Now, we need to now separate our thinking into those two different domains. The poorer, less economically privileged world. And what's going on there now is that, of course, for many years, the WHO have had recommendations that people should receive supplements of iron and folic acid. The iron level has gradually come down. It's now in the range of 30 to 60 milligrams and 400 micrograms of folic acid. And that's been recommended to be given daily. The evidence is that that has a huge effect on reducing anemia at birth, and anemia is a major contributor to maternal mortality amongst mothers who have a hemorrhage at birth. So those are very powerful outcomes. Incidentally, it has almost negligible effects, apparently, on other outcomes, such as the size of the baby. The world has now moved forward from that, and the thinking now is that we shouldn't just be giving iron and folic acid, but a mixture of 15 micronutrients, which are put together in this Unimap multiple micronutrient supplement, which is available either in powders or in tablet form. And that was added to the WHO essential medicines list in 2021. I don't know how many billions of doses are produced and distributed every year. Perhaps others in the audience, for instance, from the World Bank, may know the answer to that. I should have looked it up beforehand. But this is the initiative now to try to get multiple micronutrient supplements in pregnancy. If you actually look at the meta-analyses that were the basis for this recommendation, you might think, these are marginal gains. The gain in terms of birth weight is about 38 grams, which is less than 1% or around 1% gain in birth weight. And there's some evidence of other gains as well. But to be honest, the gains are meta-analyzed, proven gains are not that great. So we're partly doing this as a matter of public good that it surely is wrong that women should be going through pregnancy with micronutrient deficiencies. In the West, if I can put it like that, contemporary interventions are often a personal choice. There are in different countries interventions in relation to iron and folic acid again, but often it's down to personal choice. And there is a plethora of possibilities. And different women will make different choices, different families will make different choices as to whether or not it's beneficial to take such supplements. I have a view on that, but I'm not going to share that right now because it's really just an individual view. As we move beyond the fetal period, then breastfeeding, which of course we all support, is a critical period. There are supplements available for lactating mothers. Soon the Gates Foundation will add to the work that previously has been done by Nestlé in terms of breast milk composition worldwide, and there'll be a major new portfolio of data on worldwide distributions of nutrient composition of breast milk, and that I think in turn will set us scratching our heads about whether or not lactating mothers should receive certain supplements. Excuse me. Some of those are coming out very interestingly, in particular vitamin B12, which is making us scratch our heads. Now this is a time when the baby's brain is growing very, very fast. Of course, it's being trained, it's developing, and a critical period for development. So many people are looking at this as a period which perhaps could benefit from more than what is contained in breast milk. Now that's a potentially heinous comment for me to make, but I have a particular interest in terms of iron. Breast milk is very low in iron. You can see that babies become very iron deficient relatively early, very early in life if you look at serum iron levels, and serum iron is what feeds the brain. It's the only source of iron for the brain. So I would posit that maybe evolution, which has put low levels of iron in breast milk because it saved babies from infections in past times, now that we have a much more healthy environment, we might want to move those goalposts and consider giving iron much earlier, and indeed we have randomized controlled trials on that particular topic, together with other trials by my colleague Sophie Moore from London, King's College London, who is doing the Indigo trial, which has not only iron and other micronutrients, but some neuro-advancing agents as well. So those are critical periods. We move up through childhood, of course, obviously important to make sure that children have a sufficient micronutrient intake. A next stop on adolescence. There's a huge amount of interest in adolescents. 20 years ago, I guess they were a neglected group. Now there's a lot of people talking about these as a critical period. The discussion gets a little bit difficult here because originally it was sort of preparing adolescent girls for pregnancy, which was seen as rather pejorative because adolescent girls and women are not a vehicle for babies. But clearly having mothers, having parents in good nutritional shape when they come to the reproductive period is a good thing. There's this enormous example from India, the WIFS initiative, which is probably the largest, well, I think definitely the largest supplementation initiative worldwide, which is giving iron and folic acid supplements to well over 100 million adolescents. Interestingly, they choose to give them to both girls and boys in order to avoid the pejorative aspect that I've just mentioned. They also separate them out with different colored tablets so that there's no confusion between those tablets that are targeted at adolescents and those that are targeted at pregnant women. I was going to put a little session on later life, but again, we're having a talk tomorrow about that, closing the gap between health span and lifespan with diet and supplements from Andrea. I very much look forward to that in particular because we've really got some good metrics now for how we measure aging, and therefore we can really make measurements of how and what supplements would be beneficial. So that's a sort of very brief review of the critical windows that we in international public health think of when micronutrients might be most important, notwithstanding the obvious fact that they're important throughout life. I want to end up with a vignette, a more detailed vignette, as I mentioned, which is something we've done in the Gambia, but it's something that's very important to emphasize that this is likely to affect mothers worldwide. We happen to be very lucky in finding it in the Gambia, but it's almost certainly a finding that will be applicable worldwide. So what we've looked at is the very early environmental exposures that parents are subjected to at the time that they conceive, or a little bit before they conceive a baby. And we were lucky because of a feature of seasonality in the Gambia. What we're talking about here is epigenetics. Most of you will know at least something about epigenetics. You will probably know that there are various forms of epigenetics, and the one I'm going to talk about is the one at the bottom here, which is methylation. So our human genome, of course, is constant over time, but what is not constant is the methyl groups that can be laid down on a cytosine and purine, so-called CpG loci, of which there are 30 million or so that we try to measure on the human genome. And these labels affect how genes are expressed. If you take a musical analogy, the DNA itself is the notes that the composer writes down, and the epigenetic marks are the grace notes, fortissimo, pianissimo, allegro, etc. So, as I say, we're immensely fortunate to have an experiment of nature. So here's where I live and work in Kennebar, and you'll see on the right-hand side that when the rains come, as they are now, the whole environment is completely transformed. And that has an immense effect on the foods that people eat. So this is a lovely randomized trial, if you like, by nature. And what we're studying is the effects of this, of the food that people eat, in the very early development of the embryo. In fact, within the first 9 days, I won't take the time now, any of you can catch me at coffee to ask me how we know that we're looking at the effects in the first 9 days, but we're looking at the effects that are occurring just in the first 9 days of embryonic development, and from then on are faithfully replicated every time a cell divides, so they have a lifelong impact from that time henceforth. Now, the provision of these methyl groups to lay down on the DNA is very nutrient intensive. In yellow here, surrounded by red, you see the various nutrients that are important in this cycle of so-called methyl donor metabolism. On the right-hand side, you see a picture of 190 women who have had their metabolomes measured at different times of year, and you can see profound differences in many of these nutrients and intermediary metabolites that are important in the methylation pathway. So what does this do? Well, remarkably, if you know where to look, it has a very significant effect on certain regions of the genome. So in the left-hand graph there, ENID is just a description of the cohort of children that we measured this in. In the left-hand graph, you have the dry season indicated January to June, the wet season July to December. And you'll see that there's this cyclical pattern of differences in methylation according to the season. And on the right-hand side, you see violin plots showing that the peak methylation occurs for these metastable epiallyles in red in the rainy season, for season of conception CpGs in the blue, and it's completely different for all the control regions. So something important is happening that is predicated upon the exact day that a baby is conceived. Indeed, this is so clever that we can actually pretty much tell which month a baby was conceived in by looking at its DNA, or even an adult was conceived in by looking at its DNA. Now, your question will be, this is all very fancy, something is going on, but does it matter? And so far, we've already got to these as very important phenotypes that are probably affected by these very early events that are sensitive to micronutrients. Fat mass and obesity, we've got very good data showing that that is modulated by changes in the POMC gene. Thyroid size and function, cardiometabolic risk, child height, and some more esoteric things, viral infections, and probably one specific cancer, and there's emerging evidence that childhood cancers may also be affected. So, an exciting story. It's not just our own. Nestlé, in fact, have been involved in similar research, and through their collaboration with Keith Godfrey and Professor Gluckman. And here's just one of the early outputs from that trial. So I wanted to put those up just to make sure that I wasn't claiming that we were the only people in the world to be working in this area. So I'm going to stop there, but with a quick verbal summary of the key points I've been making. First of all, that micronutrients, though relatively simple chemical compounds, are embedded within complex structures of foods. Those foods, as we've already heard many times this morning, are important for multiple reasons, and we'll hear more about that throughout the whole of this meeting. That there are some critical periods in life when these are important, and if we could understand these better, I think we could be on the route to developing new interventions, be they dietary advice, or be they formulated supplements or compounds for specific periods, which is, of course, an issue of interest to a company such as Nestlé and a research institution such as this here. But at the end of the day, the challenge is that public health nutritionists need to be working with industry, with the food supply chain, to try and make sure that we can minimize micronutrient deficiencies worldwide and hence maximize human health. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Now, so we've had speakers now raise the topics of economic change, social change, behavioral change, and also Andrew has now raised the topic of seasonality. So now we're going to continue with climate change and the potential effects on maternal and child health. So here we have now our next speaker, Professor Kartik Shankar, who is Professor of Nutrition at the University of Colorado Medical School and also works with the NIH-funded Obesity Research Center in Colorado. Dr. Kartik, over to you. Thank you.
Just note to self, if you ever follow Dr. Prentice in a symposium, you'll have big shoes to fill. But it's a real pleasure to be here among you all, and really excellent program, so looking forward to a lot of interactions. So what I wanted to do this morning is to kind of just extend this discussion that we've been having around foods and micronutrients and engage you in this topic around climate change and how nutrition and climate change are on a collision course. And really kind of take an example of a study that we've been involved in to kind of make a point about the primary kind of feature of what we perceive with climate change, which is chronic heat stress. So the title of my presentation, you've seen in the notes that you have, is to really look at this interaction between resilience to heat stress and micronutrients. I don't have any conflicts to disclose. So if you have, unless you've really moved to planet Earth very recently, you probably are very familiar that we have serious issues on a planetary scale. And even though clearly this issue was what was reserved for essentially polar bears for a while ago, is really the greatest threat and a threat amplifier for human health. And so the unfolding of the climate change patterns is really impacting human health in many dimensions, especially in low and middle income countries, and I'll emphasize that. So just to kind of example of what I mean by a climate threat or a threat multiplier of what climate change is, I have two graphs for you. On the left, let's see this. On the left is the UNICEF's Children's Climate Risk Index, which is a composite score that both includes exposure and vulnerability measures. And on the right are kind of most recent data of stunting, which is a good proxy for malnutrition worldwide. And what you can see very strikingly, of course, the darker colors are versus scores. And what you can see strikingly is that the world is experiencing, the regions in the world that have malnutrition are also experiencing the greatest impacts of climate change. So in a sense, climate change really is a health disparity issue, and is really the burden is being felt acutely by those who already have the burden of malnutrition. So in this context, we kind of appreciate that climate change impacts human health through multiple modalities and sectors. And we've heard many people discuss this. And some of these happen through direct pathways, whilst others happen through indirect pathways that affect food productivity, nutritional composition of foods, vector-borne diseases, and so on and so forth. But perhaps the most relatable and the most profound impacts of climate that most of us kind of recognize on a personal level are the direct impacts of heat. And heat exposure, or extreme heat exposure, is by far the leading cause of mortality and morbidity worldwide, both in developing countries and in the developed nations, and have an enormous burden in all stages of health, from childhood all the way to adult life. So I'm going to really kind of focus on extreme heat exposure and kind of draw a picture of what the world looks like and what the context of extreme heat exposure is for in the context of malnutrition. And this enormity of the heat issue was recently crystallized very elegantly by a UNICEF report that was elegantly labeled the coldest year of the rest of their lives, pointing that every year for these children that were born in 2020, for example, they will only have more and more heat exposures throughout their life. In fact, today, over 600 million children are exposed to high heat wave frequency across the globe. And no matter what scenarios of reasonable scenarios of climate change happen in the next 20 years, virtually every child on the planet will be exposed to greater heat wave frequencies by 2050. So this is not an issue that we can escape, and we really need to figure out adaptation strategies and impacts on health outcomes throughout the life course. But despite the enormity of this issue, we have a serious risk communication issue around the question of heat. So every time there is an imminent heat wave in the Western world, we see images like this in the news media of children kind of happily playing under a water fountain. But what is clear is that the reality in the developing world looks very different. More like this, where individuals have no recourse from the elements, are looking for shade under a bridge, or farmers and livestock really driven to extreme measures, and then even subsistence lives are further driven to deprivations. And this is really the reality that most individuals in the developing world face when they have excessive heat exposure. So there is growing collective evidence, and I won't go into much of the details, but just kind of present a collective consensus to you around where we are around heat and pregnancy outcomes. Pregnancy is certainly, like you heard Dr. Prentice talk about, a very sensitive window for lifelong health outcomes. And there is growing consensus that there are a number of detrimental outcomes related to high temperatures and heat stress in pregnancy. A recent meta-analysis that involved over 70 studies showed that the risk of both preterm birth, stillbirth, and low birth weight were actually increased substantially with both chronic heat and acute heat events, so such as heat waves, which we are particularly more familiar with. But hidden in this kind of consensus data is the fact that there is a large heterogeneity in the way we approach measurement of heat and the methods and the windows people have used to define what exposure means. And only a small fraction of these studies actually were done in low and middle income countries, where I noted that the burden is really the largest. And in fact, even among those, most of them were done in middle income countries. So there is a huge dearth of data as to the associations between heat and health outcomes in the people who are affected the most. Most notably for this audience, I think it's important to note that measures of maternal nutritional status or even sub-analysis based on the health of mothers is completely absent. So we really truly don't understand what the impacts of existing nutritional burdens and the collective impacts of heat and other environmental stressors are. So this certainly is an important topic because it's going to be with us for a long time. So to address this, I'm going to share some data with you from our experience from a trial called the Women First Preconception Nutrition Trial. So I'm going to quickly walk you through what this trial was about and kind of set the stage for some of the data I'm going to share with you. So bear with me. The Women First Nutrition Trial was a preconception nutritional intervention that was done in 4 countries on 3 continents. The countries that are listed here, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Guatemala, India, and Pakistan, where a randomized control intervention with multiple micronutrient supplementation, the UniMap formulation, and balanced energy protein was provided to women either 3 months prior to conception in arm 1, or was provided during pregnancy in arm 2, or they were given iron and folic acid as a control. And in this context, a number of measures were collected. The primary outcomes that were measured in this trial were birth anthropometry, but longitudinal measures of infant anthropometry were collected over the first 2 years of life. So this kind of study was held in rural and semi-rural places in these countries and in these communities, and gave us this kind of perfect opportunity to understand the interactions between environmental exposures and nutritional status. So just to kind of give you a little bit more detail, we really focused our primary analysis on the Pakistan side of the Women First trial, and there were some specific reasons for this. Firstly, Pakistan ranks very highly on the Children's Climate Risk Index. So it is a vulnerable site where both heat exposures and malnutrition are highly prevalent. Indeed, every summer in this context, temperatures rise over 40 degrees Celsius, and there is very little air conditioning and other kind of modern heat mitigation approaches. So people really feel the heat in these areas. Secondly, a high percentage of women of childbearing age and in pregnancy have vulnerabilities that are nutritional in nature. So for example, over 75% have zinc deficiency, over 70% have anemia, and a large proportion of the women have low BMIs when they enter pregnancy. And also they have low socioeconomic status, and over close to 85% of women have no formal education. So this is a context where both the environmental stresses and the nutritional status are co-present. And so for our approach, what we essentially did was leverage this trial and its data and retrospectively look at meteorological data from these sites and bridge this gap between exposure to temperatures during pregnancy windows. So we essentially calculated maximal daily temperatures during pregnancy windows based on conception date and gestational length, and then did regression analyses with the primary outcomes at birth, which were birth length, birth weight, and head circumference. And I'm going to share in the next few slides some primary findings from these analyses. So on the left are plotted these scatter plots or regression plots for birth length z-scores at gestational age adjusted birth length z-scores and the maximal temperature in the first trimester. And what we noticed is a strong negative association between birth length and the temperature maximums in the first trimester. The first trimester is very important for placentation and overall setting for gestational growth. And whether you express this as a continuous association or discretized it, who have high exposure to, say, extreme heat, so in this case, it's the number of days where somebody was exposed to over 40 degrees Celsius. Both of these measures decreased gestational birth length and head circumference. So more formal analyses showed that for every 5-degree increase in the temperature in the first trimester, birth length decreased by almost 0.15 z-scores, which was actually comparable to the primary effect of the micronutrient supplementation, essentially telling us that you can actually undo the effects of nutrition supplementation with what's happening with environmental stressors. But given that the study was a randomized controlled trial where women were assigned to these micronutrient supplementation pre-conception, we had an opportunity to understand what would happen if women's nutritional status was improved in the context of this heat exposure. And what we found was really remarkable, and I'm going to kind of walk you through it, which is that arm 1 for the first trimester exposure was the only arm for which preconception micronutrient supplementation was given. So for a first trimester exposure, arms 2 and 3 essentially served as no intervention. And what you can see is that the effect of heat on birth length was only present in arms 2 and 3, and was actually absent in arm 1, suggesting that you can improve, by improving maternal nutritional status, we were improving the resilience of mothers against heat stress on this outcome of diminishing birth length. We've done similar analyses, not with the nutritional supplementation, but the overall generic effects of heat in another birth registry maintained by the NICHD, and those publications also show increased risk for preterm birth and low birth weight with excessive heat in different trimesters. We're really kind of interested now then in understanding how this might happen and what the primary mechanisms might be. But before I jump to that, I want to kind of draw your attention to kind of more unpublished results that we have, where we've now looked at the association between first trimester temperature and birth length across all sites. And again, we have this negative association between birth length and the first trimester temperature, here now measured as a thermal stress index called the wet bulb globe temperature. And indeed, this association is diminished again in the arms that did receive nutritional supplementation, suggesting, and this is data from approximately 2,200 women from all 4 sites of the Women First trial. So heat has multiple impacts on physiology, and these have been very well documented in adults. The effects in pregnancy are actually much less studied. This is a nice illustration by Christy Ebai and all, showing that heat has multiple effects. And in the context of pregnancy and malnutrition, heat may have effects on inflammation, may cause dehydration, certainly impacts placental function, and nutrient absorption, and all these effects can synergize with low micronutrient status. So in the context of the placenta, during heat stress, individuals shunt blood flow towards the periphery and cause hypooxygenation within the trunk and the uterine placental region. So we've been really interested in kind of understanding on a transcriptional level what the effects of pregnancy heat stress are, because these are likely operative in the primary outcome of growth retardation. So we've conducted both transcriptomics and blood metabolomics in the context of association analyses with first trimester heat stress. And what we kind of very briefly to summarize these, genes that are changed in the placenta essentially signal for placental insufficiency and poor trophoblast growth and poor placentation, suggesting that early pregnancy heat stress might set up the placenta in such a way that it impairs placental invasion and development, and that eventually it leads to fetal stress. And this is also associated with maternal changes in metabolites, including those that regulate vascular flow and blood pressure in the mother. So these kind of changes are obviously happening during pregnancy in the mother to set the stage for poor pregnancy outcomes. We've also have some data to suggest that microRNA profiles that can signal for placental development in the mom's circulation can be impacted or are associated with heat. And these might serve as biomarkers to be monitored in pregnancy to look at heat exposure in vulnerable populations. So certainly, I've kind of told you a little bit about what the interaction between a nutritional status and heat exposure might be. But we're now trying to delve into questions around what is the effect of heat on status of nutrients themselves. And one interesting example of nutritional status is iron status and anemia. And there's growing evidence to suggest that air pollution, for example, exposure to PM 2.5 levels, can cause anemia in populations, primarily because it drives inflammation. And there is an analogy here with heat stress because in agricultural animals, it is well known that when animals get heat stress, they have endotoxemia because of impaired gut permeability, and that this inflammation is associated with impaired immune function. So we've been interested in understanding whether there are any associations between high temperatures and anemia status. So in this context of the Women First trial, we've measured markers of iron status and hemoglobin. And very briefly, I can tell you that based on kind of preliminary analyses, certainly there seems to be a negative association between the number of extreme heat days, so the days about 39 degrees, in the first trimester, and measures of anemia. So hemoglobin goes down, and there are other measures, and the risk of anemia goes up as there's greater exposure to these high heat days. And this is data from Pakistan. So not only does heat impact the length of the baby by affecting gestational growth, but we've also done linear mixed models to look at longitudinal change in height for age z-scores over the first 2 years of life. And our results suggest that extreme heat in the first trimester actually impacts the growth of infants in the first 2 years of life, diminishing attained height for age z-scores, suggesting that this is a persistent change that's probably happening to growth throughout the first couple of years of life. So there could be other, in addition to this effect being mediated by birth length, because birth length is a strong predictor for height of age z-scores, this effect could also be mediated by other postnatal changes. So for example, changes in milk composition and other factors that happen postnatally and determine the growth of the child. And there is certainly ample evidence to suggest that lactation is strongly influenced by heat exposure. Indeed, we know much, much more about the impact of heat on lactating dairy cows than we know about in humans. But there's no reason to assume that heat does not affect lactation in humans, although there's very little data. There's an elegant study from Burkina Faso that was recently published that suggested that breastfeeding duration was diminished as temperature went up. But this was dependent on the age of the child, and there is really very little evidence on what happens to both lactation efficiency and the composition of breast milk as temperature goes up. And this is highly relevant because these populations are breastfeeding in these environmental conditions. So we've kind of briefly looked at breast milk composition in the Women First trial, and we found, as Dr. Prentice had shown some seasonal data, that actually we found a strong seasonality in breast milk energy content and fat content. But from these studies, we really don't know what the effect on overall quantity of milk is, whether overall lactation is diminished. We do have some quantitative evidence and associations between temperature in the window of lactation, so in the 30-day window when breast milk was collected, and it certainly has associations with specific nutrients such as choline and vitamin B2 and total energy content. But this picture of the association between breast milk composition and temperature is still a kind of a hazy picture that needs to be developed more. One of the interesting attributes of lactation is that most of preparatory phase of lactation and breast development actually happens just in gestation, so that as soon as the baby is born and progesterone levels go down, lactation is kicked in. One of the interesting findings we found from a placental analysis was that the two primary placental lactogens, the chorionic somatogrammatotropin hormones, the expression of these genes in the placenta was diminished in association with third trimester heat stress, suggesting that there could be this persistent developmental defect with heat stress in pregnancy that could set somebody up for poorer lactational performance. Although this is just a hypothesis and needs to be tested with true measures of quantitative milk feeding studies. So I'm going to leave you with 3 simple messages from these studies. Nutrition certainly has a central role in the nexus of climate and health. We do have sufficient evidence to to have a consensus that heat is detrimental to many pregnancy outcomes for the mother and perhaps for the child, although that data is still developing. But certainly there is this nexus between mom's nutritional status, especially in impoverished regions, and their resilience to provide against heat stress. So I think kind of holistically looking at this picture of both the stressors that come from the environment and nutritional stressors is important. So with that, I'm kind of stop and thank you all for your attention.